Number fifth, 10 years with the DEA. 6 years married. I thought I knew how to read people. I was wrong about one of them. My name is Joel Hargrove. I'm 44 years old. I run a private security consulting firm out of Charlotte, North Carolina. The kind of business that helps corporations protect their supply chains, their executives, their sensitive data. I built it from scratch after I left federal service in 2016. By last year, we had 11 full-time employees, 3 major Fortune 500 contracts, and annual revenue just north of $2.1 million. I also had a wife named Sandra, a 9-year-old daughter named Lily, and what I believed was a marriage worth protecting. I was wrong about that too. I want to be honest about something before I tell this story. I wasn't a perfect husband. I know that. I worked long hours. I missed dinners. I missed a school play in February because I was in Houston doing a threat assessment for a petrochemical client. Sandra reminded me of that night more times than I can count, but I never stopped loving my family. Not once. And I never, not for a single day, stopped working so that Lily could go to a good school, and Sandra could live the life she'd grown up expecting. The granite countertops, the weekend trips to Asheville, the membership at the club her parents had belonged to for 30 years. I say this not to make myself sound like a martyr. I say it because what happened next will only make sense if you understand where I was coming from when I walked into my office that Tuesday morning in March and found a stranger sitting in the lobby. He was wearing a charcoal suit. Expensive, mid-40s maybe, the kind of man who coordinates his tie with his pocket square. He stood when he saw me, and before I could even ask who he was, he handed me a manila envelope. "Mr. Hargrove, I represent your wife." I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. "You're serving me divorce papers," I said, "at my place of business." My client felt this was the most neutral location. I almost laughed. Neutral. Sandra had sent this man to the office I had built from a spare bedroom and a $12,000 loan so she could feel like the territory was neutral. I took the envelope. My assistant, Brenda, was watching from her desk with wide eyes. 2 of my analysts had just come in from the parking lot and had clearly heard enough to understand what was happening. The lawyer, his name was Philip Marsh, it said so on the card he produced, stood there as if he expected me to fall apart right there in the lobby of my own company. I didn't. I said, "Can you wait here for about 10 minutes? He blinked. "Excuse me? I'm going to ask you to wait here. 10 minutes. I have something for you to take back to your client." He looked confused. Attorneys like him are used to controlling the room. They hand you the papers, they watch you crumble, they walk out. That's the script. I wasn't following it. I went to my office. I closed the door. I did not open the manila envelope Sandra had sent. I already knew most of what was in it. I'd known this was coming for about 4 months. What I did instead was open the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, the one with the separate key that I'd never told Sandra about, and I took out a sealed, letter-sized envelope. Cream-colored, my initials monogrammed in the corner because Sandra had bought me those envelopes 3 Christmases ago, and I'd always thought the gesture was more about her taste than my needs. I found it quietly funny, standing there, that the envelopes she'd given me would be the ones I used for this. I walked back out to the lobby. Marsh was still standing. He hadn't even sat down, with his hands folded and his expression carefully neutral. I handed him the envelope. "Please make sure Sandra gets this before end of business today," I said. "It's important she reads it before her attorney team moves forward with anything." He took it. He looked at it. He looked at me. "Mr. Hargrove, I'm not a courier. You came to my place of business uninvited to hand me papers," I said quietly. "The least you can do is take something back, unless you'd prefer I send it directly to Judge Calloway's office." His expression changed. Just slightly. Just enough. "I'll see that she gets it," he said. He left. Brenda looked at me from across the lobby. I told her to hold my calls. I went back into my office, sat down at my desk, and for the first time that morning, I opened Sandra's envelope and read what she was asking for. She wanted the house. She wanted full custody of Lily. She wanted 40% of my company's annual revenue for 7 years. and her attorney had attached a sworn affidavit describing me as emotionally unavailable, prone to surveillance behavior, and psychologically controlling. I read that last part twice. Surveillance behavior. Psychologically controlling. I set the papers down on my desk and I thought about the past 6 months. I thought about the night I'd come home early from a canceled client meeting and found a car I didn't recognize parked on the street in front of our house. I thought about how Sandra had been on her phone more than usual. About the weekend she told me she was visiting her college roommate in Raleigh, and I'd called that roommate for an unrelated reason, and the roommate had no idea Sandra was supposed to be there. I thought about all the things I'd noticed and filed away quietly, the way I'd been trained to do for 10 years. And I thought about the file inside that cream envelope. Let me back up to November. Sandra and I had been having problems for at least 2 years. But by November, it had become a particular kind of silence between us. Not the comfortable quiet of two people who know each other well. The other kind. The kind where you can feel someone composing things in their head that they're not saying out loud. In November, I came across something by accident. I was updating our shared home network. We'd had some connectivity issues, and I noticed a device logged into our Wi-Fi that I didn't recognize. Tablet. Manufacturer ID traced back to a model Sandra didn't own. I didn't say anything. I just started paying attention. What I found over the next 8 weeks, through entirely legal means. Our shared cloud backup, our joint financial accounts, records I was legally entitled to access as her spouse and as a co-signer on our accounts, was enough to make my stomach drop the first time I looked at it. Sandra had been seeing someone for at least 14 months. His name, as best as I could piece together, was Kevin Drummond. He was 41. He had a business degree from UNC Wilmington and worked in commercial real estate. He drove a dark blue Audi, the car I'd seen on our street. But that was the smaller thing. The bigger thing was the money. Our joint savings account, not my business accounts, which were completely separate and protected, but the personal joint account we'd maintained together, had been quietly drained over the course of 9 months, not all at once. Small transfers, $3,000 here, $5,000 there, always just under the threshold that would have triggered an automatic bank alert, transferred to an account I didn't recognize. $74,000 in total. I sat with that number for a long time. I'm not an emotional man by nature. The DEA trains that out of you, or maybe it's selected for people who already had it trained out of them. I don't know which it was for me. But I sat at my desk at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night in January, and I felt something I hadn't felt since my first undercover operation. That specific, cold clarity that comes when you understand exactly how much danger you're in and you realize that falling apart is not one of your options. I called my personal attorney the next morning. His name is Thomas Webb, and he's been practicing family law in Charlotte for 22 years. I told him everything. I showed him everything I had. I told him I needed to understand exactly what Sandra was likely to do and exactly what my rights were before she made a move. Thomas looked at the financial records for a long time. Then he looked at me. She's been building a case, he said. Someone's been advising her. This isn't something a person just does naturally. I asked him if he meant Kevin Drummond. He said Kevin Drummond was likely involved, but that the financial pattern looked like it had been set up with some professional guidance, someone who understood asset concealment. What do you want to do? Thomas asked me. I told him I wanted to do this right. I wanted documentation of everything before she filed anything. I wanted to understand what Lily's situation would look like in a custody hearing. And I told him there was one more thing, the $74,000 that I suspected was not just marital asset dissipation, which is already a serious legal matter in North Carolina, but that some of those transfers might be tied to Kevin Drummond's business accounts in a way that would be very interesting to the IRS. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Do you have documentation of that? I told him I was working on it. I want to pause here because I know what some people think when they hear a story like this. They think the husband is the one who went too far. That I was the controlling, paranoid spouse Sandra's attorney described in that affidavit. I want you to think about something. I found the Drummond's device on my own home network. I accessed our joint accounts I had every legal right to access. I didn't tap her phone. I didn't follow her. I didn't put a tracker on her car. I used the tools and the habits of a decade in federal law enforcement to look at information I was legally entitled to see. Was it cold? Yes. Was it clinical? Probably. Did it feel like love? No. But when someone is transferring $74,000 out of your shared savings while building a legal case to take your daughter in your company, I would ask you honestly, what would you have done differently? By February, Thomas and I had compiled everything into what he called the most organized pre-divorce file he'd seen in 20 years of practice. Financial records, transaction logs, documentation of the transfers, the destination account, and the paper trail that connected that account to Kevin Drummond's LLC, a commercial real estate holding company that had, in the past year, reported a suspiciously convenient uptick in capital. There was also a detail Thomas found that I hadn't uncovered myself, one that changed the shape of everything. Kevin Drummond had a prior civil judgment against him from 2019. A business partner in a real estate deal in Wilmington had sued him for fraudulent misrepresentation, essentially for lying about the financial condition of a property he was selling. Drummond had settled out of court for $188,000. He'd done this before, not with a spouse's money, but he'd done this before. Thomas said, "This man has a pattern." I said I knew. Thomas said, "Your wife may not know the full extent of who she's involved with." I said that was her problem now, and that was what was in the cream-colored envelope I handed to Philip Marsh that Tuesday morning in March. Not threats, not emotional appeals. A complete, organized, documented account of $74,000 in marital asset dissipation, its connection to Kevin Drummond's LLC, Drummond's prior civil fraud judgment, and a letter from Thomas Webb informing Sandra's legal team that we would be filing our own motion with the court before the end of the week, and that we would be forwarding a referral to the IRS regarding potential tax irregularities in Drummond's business accounts. There was also a single handwritten note from me on the last page. It said, "Sandra, I know you think you've thought of everything. You haven't. Call Thomas Webb's office. This doesn't have to go the way you're planning." By 7 o'clock that evening, my phone was ringing. It wasn't Sandra. It was her mother. I'd always had a complicated relationship with my mother-in-law, Eleanor. She was a woman who had strong opinions about what kind of life her daughter deserved, and for most of our marriage she'd been polite to me in the specific way that people are polite to someone they've decided is acceptable but not ideal. I was never the man she'd imagined for Sandra. I didn't come from the right family. I hadn't gone to the right school. When I picked up, Eleanor's voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. The polish was gone. "How do you know about Kevin's business?" she said. No greeting, no preamble. I said, "Hello, Eleanor." "Joel, how much do you know?" I said. "Probably more than Sandra does." There was a long silence. "He told her it was an investment," Eleanor said finally. She thought she was protecting herself, protecting her future. She didn't know where it would go. And that's when I understood something that Thomas hadn't told me, something the documents hadn't shown me clearly until that moment. Sandra hadn't known about the 2019 judgment. She hadn't known the full history. Kevin Drummond had told her that transferring the money into his LLC was a smart move, a way to protect her assets before the divorce, to make sure she walked away with something real. She'd believed him. She trusted a man who had already done this to someone else. I don't know exactly what I felt in that moment. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't sympathy either, at least not entirely. Sandra had still made her choices. She'd still moved $74,000 out of our shared account. She'd still been in that relationship for over a year while sleeping in the same house as me and our daughter. But I thought about Lily. I thought about what a prolonged, vicious court battle would do to a 9-year-old girl. I thought about what it would mean for Sandra to walk out of this marriage having also been defrauded by the man she'd left it for. I told Eleanor that I was open to a conversation, that Sandra needed to come to the table through Thomas, and that she needed to come prepared to be honest about everything. All of it. Eleanor said she would make sure of it. The next 3 months were some of the hardest of my life, even though nothing dramatic happened. No courtroom showdowns, no explosive confrontations, just the slow, exhausting work of dismantling a life you built with someone and trying to figure out what you can save from the wreckage. What we worked out, in mediation, was this. The The $74,000 would be treated as Sandra's advance on her share of marital assets. Essentially, she'd already taken it, and it would be deducted from her settlement accordingly. Kevin Drummond's LLC was under IRS review, which meant that money was likely gone regardless. Sandra's attorney had quietly stopped mentioning the affidavit about my surveillance behavior. Sandra and I agreed to joint legal custody of Lily, with primary physical custody with me during the school year, and a schedule that gave Sandra full access every other week and all major holidays alternating. My attorneys argued, and the mediator agreed, that the stability of Lily remaining in the school she'd attended for 3 years was in her best interest. Sandra got the house, or rather, she got the equity, since neither of us wanted to stay in it. We sold it in June. She moved into an apartment in the South Park area. I bought a smaller place in Dilworth, close enough to Lily's school that we can walk on good mornings. Kevin Drummond, as near as I can tell, moved back to Wilmington when the IRS inquiry started. Sandra doesn't talk about him. I don't ask. I want to tell you about a Saturday in August. About 3 months after everything was finalized. Lily and I had driven out to Lake Norman for the day. She's at that age where she's starting to develop real opinions about things. Music, books, which parents' cooking she prefers, and she'd spent most of the drive out giving me a detailed review of a graphic novel series she'd been reading. I didn't understand half of it, but I kept asking questions because I loved hearing her talk when she forgot to be self-conscious about it. We were sitting on a dock in the late afternoon, feet in the water, and out of nowhere she said, "Dad, are you sad?" I looked at her. She was watching the water. I said, "Sometimes. Are you?" She said, "Yeah, but not like all the time." I said, "Me neither, not all the time." She leaned against my arm for a minute, and then she said, "I'm glad you didn't move away." I put my arm around her, and I thought about the manila envelope I'd been handed in March, and the cream-colored one I'd sent back, and all the months of quiet, careful preparation that had kept me from losing this, from losing her. I said, "I'm not going anywhere, Lily." And I meant it in every way I was capable of meaning it. People ask me sometimes, usually men who've heard pieces of this story, what I would tell someone in my situation, someone who sees the signs, knows something is wrong, and feels the ground starting to shift. I tell them 2 things. First, don't act from anger. Anger makes you sloppy. It makes you say things that become evidence, do things that can be used against you. The moment you got served or blindsided or found out, that is the moment to get very, very quiet. The quieter you are, the more clearly you can see. Second, document everything you have legal access to. Not illegally, not vindictively, but completely. Because the people who plan these things count on you being too emotional, too proud, or too blindsided to respond methodically. They count on you handing them the advantage. They counted wrong. I won't tell you the aftermath of all this is clean or easy. I still have nights where I drive home to a house that's too quiet and think about how different I thought my life was going to look at 44. I still sit across from Sandra at Lily's school events and feel something complicated that I don't have a clean word for. But I also have a daughter who walks to school with me on Tuesday mornings and talks about whatever's in her head for 35 minutes straight. And I have a company that nobody took from me. And I have the knowledge that when everything came apart, I handled it the way I was trained to. With patience, with discipline, and with a quiet certainty that preparation is the only thing that separates someone who survives a situation from someone who gets buried by it. Philip Marsh, the attorney Sandra sent to my lobby, filed a motion to withdraw from her case 11 days after I handed him that envelope. I don't know exactly what happened. I can guess. Sometimes patience is the most devastating weapon you own. And sometimes the people who come to your door expecting to watch you fall apart leave carrying the very thing that brings them down. I've thought a lot about what I would have done differently if I'd let anger drive me instead of discipline. Probably everything wrong. There's a version of this story where I confronted Sandra the night I found the transfers, where I threw accusations across the kitchen and she denied everything and we both said things that became ammunition, where I lost my temper in front of my assistant when Philip Marsh walked into my lobby, where I fought dirty and loud and gave her attorneys exactly the psychologically controlling narrative they were trying to build. That version of the story ends with me losing Lily. I know it does. What I've come to understand, not from a book, not from a podcast, but from actually living through the worst 12 months of my adult life, is that the choices you make in the first moments of a crisis determine almost everything that comes after. Not the dramatic choices, not the big confrontations, the quiet ones. The choice to close your office door instead of making a scene, the choice to call your attorney before you call your spouse, the choice to document instead of react. Those choices are made of something that most people don't want to talk about because it sounds cold. Self-discipline in the presence of pain. That's not the same as suppressing emotion. I felt everything. I felt it at 11 o'clock at night, staring at bank records that told me my marriage was already over. I felt it every morning. I drove Lily to school, knowing what I knew, and saying nothing. Feeling it and acting on it are two entirely different things, and the distance between those two things is where your future actually lives. Sandra made choices too. She chose a man who'd already defrauded a business partner out of $188,000 and told herself it was protection. She chose to move money quietly instead of having an honest conversation. Every one of those choices had a consequence she didn't fully see coming. Not because life is tidy and fair, but because shortcuts built on dishonesty tend to collapse under their own weight. Kevin Drummond wasn't some outside force that happened to Sandra. He was the direct result of the decisions she'd already been making for months. That's not cruelty. That's just how things tend to work out when you trade integrity for convenience. And Lily. I think about Lily most of all. She didn't choose any of this. She's 9 years old, and she's already learning things about how the world works that no kid should have to learn. But she's also watching how her father handles hard things. She's watching whether I show up, whether I stay steady, whether I'm someone she can count on when everything else is shifting. That matters more to me than any settlement, any court ruling, any piece of paper. I'm not going to tell you I came through this as some better, wiser version of myself. I'm still the same man who works too many hours and forgets to call people back and has nights where the house feels too quiet. But I came through it with my daughter, my company, and my own sense of who I am intact. And the way I did that was by refusing to let the worst moment of my life make me into someone I wasn't. That's the only thing I know for certain. You don't get to control what people do to you. You only get to control what you do next.